They say a mother's love is unconditional, but no one ever warns you that sometimes love becomes a prison you build with your own hands. My name is Eva. I'm 63 years old, and today I want to share with you the story of how I learned that the deepest betrayals come from those we love most. The rain was falling hard that Tuesday afternoon when my world changed forever. I can still hear the sound of those drops hitting the bathroom window, each one marking another second of humiliation that would burn in my memory forever. But let me start from the beginning, because every story of awakening begins with a long sleep. For 41 years, I dedicated my life to being a mother. When my husband David walked out that door on a cold March morning, leaving nothing but a note saying he needed to find himself, I made a promise that would define the rest of my existence. Liam would never lack anything, never feel abandoned, never question his worth. I was 22 then, young enough to believe that love could conquer everything. Naive enough to think that sacrifice was always noble. I gave up my nursing degree when I was just 6 months away from graduating. The scholarship I'd fought so hard to get, the dreams I'd nurtured since I was a little girl playing with toy stethoscopes, all of it became secondary to my son's needs. Children need their mother, I told myself, while working double shifts at the local diner to pay for his clothes, his school supplies, his birthday parties where I made sure he was always the happiest child in the room. Children need stability, I whispered while sewing patches on my own worn clothes so I could buy him new ones. Every sacrifice felt like an investment in love. Every sleepless night when he was sick, every time I said no to my own needs so I could say yes to his, every dream I postponed for later. It all made sense because I was building something beautiful. I was creating a bond that nothing could break. Liam grew up to be everything I'd hoped for: intelligent, charming, successful. He became an architect, got married to a lovely girl named Sarah, bought a house in the suburbs that made me burst with pride every time I visited. "Look what my boy accomplished," I would tell the neighbors, my chest swelling with the kind of satisfaction that comes from a job well done. But somewhere along the way, without me noticing, the dynamic began to shift. The boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and broken hearts started seeing my presence as inconvenient. The young man who once called me every day gradually reduced our conversations to hurried check-ins. The successful architect who had built his life on the foundation of my sacrifices began to view me as a relic from a past he'd rather forget. It started small, the way these things always do. Phone calls that went straight to voicemail, visits that were shortened because of work emergencies, conversations where he seemed distracted, always checking his phone, always somewhere else even when his body was sitting across from me. "Mom, you don't understand the pressure I'm under," he would say when I tried to express how lonely I felt. "Things are different now. I can't just drop everything like before." I convinced myself this was normal. Children grow up. They build their own lives. They don't need their mothers the same way. It's the natural order of things, isn't it? But deep in my heart, a small voice whispered that something was wrong, that the boy who once promised he would always take care of me was slowly, methodically, erasing me from his life. The hip surgery happened on a Thursday in November. A simple procedure, the doctor assured me, but at 63, simple takes longer to heal. I would need help for a few weeks, assistance with groceries, with cleaning, with the basic tasks that suddenly seemed insurmountable when every step sent shooting pain through my body. "Of course I'll help, Mom," Liam said when I called to tell him about the surgery. But his voice had that distant quality I'd grown to recognize, the tone he used when agreeing to something he found burdensome. "Sarah and I will figure something out." The first week after surgery, he visited twice. Quick, obligatory stops where he brought groceries I hadn't asked for, and spoke in the patient tone people use with elderly relatives they consider helpless. He checked his watch frequently, made phone calls in my living room about work projects that couldn't wait, and left as soon as he felt he'd done his duty. "I know this is hard for you, Mom," he said during one of these visits, not quite meeting my eyes. "But you have to understand that I have responsibilities now. A career, a wife, a mortgage. I can't put my life on hold indefinitely. As if caring for the woman who had raised him single-handedly was some kind of endless burden rather than a temporary need. As if the 4 decades I'd spent putting my life on hold for him had somehow expired, like a warranty that was no longer valid. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment telling us which city you're watching from. By the second week, his visits became even more sporadic. He would send Sarah instead. Sweet Sarah, who was clearly uncomfortable with the arrangement, but too polite to refuse her husband's request. She would bring meals, sit with me for a few minutes, making awkward conversation, and leave with visible relief. Liam's really busy with a big project, she would explain, her eyes not quite meeting mine. He wanted to come himself, but you know how demanding his work can be. I nodded and smiled, playing the understanding mother, the grateful patient, the woman who didn't want to be a burden. But inside, a cold realization was taking root. My son was ashamed of me, ashamed of my small apartment with its outdated furniture and fading photographs, ashamed of my dependence, my need, my very existence as a reminder of where he came from. The final humiliation came on that rainy Tuesday, 3 weeks after my surgery. I had been feeling better, moving around more confidently, but the bathroom floor was slippery from the humidity, and my weakened hip betrayed me. I fell hard, my body crashing against the toilet, pain exploding through my hip and radiating down my leg like liquid fire. "Liam!" I called out, my voice echoing off the bathroom tiles. "Liam, please help me!" I heard his footsteps in the hallway, quick and decisive. Relief flooded through me. My son was here. He would help me. Everything would be okay. But the footsteps stopped just outside the bathroom door. "Liam!" I called again, my voice smaller now, uncertainty creeping in. And then I heard it, the sound that would haunt me forever. The click of the lock. He was locking me in. "I'm not your nurse anymore, Mom," came his voice through the door, calm and cold and final. I never signed up for this. In that moment, lying on the cold bathroom floor, pain shooting through my body and humiliation flooding my soul, I understood with crystal clarity what I had become in my son's eyes. Not a mother deserving of love and respect. Not a woman who had sacrificed everything for his happiness. Not even a human being worthy of basic compassion. I was a burden, an inconvenience, a problem to be locked away until someone else could deal with it. The silence that followed was deafening. The hours I spent on that bathroom floor taught me something profound about human nature. When someone decides you're disposable, they can walk away from your pain with surprising ease. It was Mrs. Henderson from next door who finally found me, her worried voice calling through my apartment when she noticed my lights had been on all night. "Ava? Ava, honey, are you all right in there?" By then, my voice was barely a whisper, my body cramped and cold, my spirit broken in ways that had nothing to do with my injured hip. When the paramedics finally lifted me from that floor, I wasn't the same woman who had fallen. Something fundamental had died in those hours of abandonment. The last remnants of my faith in the love I thought was unconditional. Liam showed up at the hospital eventually, of course. He had to. Sarah had called him, frantic with worry when Mrs. Henderson contacted her after finding my emergency contact list on my refrigerator. He arrived with flowers, expensive ones, the kind you buy when you're trying to compensate for something, and the practiced expression of concern that people wear when they're performing rather than feeling. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said, placing the flowers on my bedside table without meeting my eyes. "I had to step out for a work call. You know how important this project is. I never imagined— I thought you were just resting. Just resting. As if my desperate calls for help had been casual conversation. As if the sound of my body hitting the floor hadn't echoed through the apartment like a gunshot. As if he hadn't deliberately locked that door and walked away from my pain. But what hurt more than his lie was watching how easily he delivered it. How smoothly the words rolled off his tongue. How genuinely confused he seemed that anyone would question his version of events. He'd convinced himself that his abandonment had been reasonable, justified, even unavoidable. "These things happen with elderly people," he explained to the nurse, as if I weren't lying right there listening to every word. "She's been having some balance issues since the surgery. We've been trying to help, but you know how independent seniors can be. They don't always ask for help when they need it." Independent seniors. Elderly people. He was talking about me like I was a category rather than a person. A problem to be managed rather than the woman who had held him through nightmares and celebrated every milestone of his life. The nurse, a kind woman named Patricia who reminded me of myself at that age, looked between us with the sharp perception that comes from years of watching family dynamics play out in hospital rooms. She'd heard this kind of explanation before, seen this kind of careful distance that adult children maintain when they're already mentally preparing for the burden to become someone else's responsibility. Mrs. Morrison will need more intensive support during her recovery, Patricia said carefully, her professional tone carrying an undertone of judgment that Liam either didn't hear or chose to ignore. Falls at her age can be very serious. She'll need someone checking on her regularly, helping with daily activities. Of course, Liam replied quickly, too quickly. We're looking into options. Professional care, you know. Sarah and I have been researching assisted living facilities that might be more appropriate for someone in Mom's condition. My condition. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been an independent woman recovering from routine surgery. Now I had a condition that required institutionalization. Amazing how quickly circumstances could be reframed when someone wanted to justify their abandonment. Sarah stood behind him, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot, her face a mask of polite concern that couldn't quite hide her relief. She'd never signed up to care for her husband's aging mother, and now there was a way out that wouldn't make her look heartless. Professional care, assisted living, clean, sanitized solutions that would ease everyone's conscience while removing the inconvenience of actual caregiving. Mom, you have to understand, Liam continued, finally looking at me directly, but speaking as if he were addressing a child who needed to be convinced of something for her own good. These places are really nice now. They have activities, medical staff, people your own age. You might actually enjoy the social aspect. People my own age. As if 63 was ancient. As if I belonged with the forgotten elderly rather than in the life of the son I'd raised. I was younger than many working professionals, healthier than most women my age despite the recent surgery, still sharp and capable and full of life. But in his narrative, I'd become a burden that needed to be placed somewhere safe and out of the way. The social worker arrived the next morning, an efficient young woman with a tablet and a sympathetic smile who'd clearly handled thousands of these family transitions. She spoke about me in the third person, even when I was sitting right there, discussing my care needs and living options, as if I were a package to be delivered rather than a human being with preferences and feelings. Mrs. Morrison's son has expressed concern about her safety living alone, she explained to me while looking at her screen. Given the recent fall and her recovery needs, we think a transitional care facility might be the best option while we evaluate her long-term housing situation. Long-term housing situation. I'd lived in that apartment for 15 years, had made it my home, filled it with memories and photographs and the accumulated treasures of a life fully lived. But apparently, it was just a housing situation that needed to be evaluated by people who'd known me for less than 24 hours. Liam nodded along enthusiastically, asking practical questions about costs and logistics, discussing my life as if it were a business arrangement that needed to be optimized for everyone's convenience. He'd brought a folder, an actual folder, filled with printed information about facilities he'd already researched, complete with highlighted sections about their medical capabilities and social programs. I've done quite a bit of research, he told the social worker proudly, opening his folder like a student presenting a well-prepared project. There are several excellent options in the area. This one has a wonderful reputation for post-surgical rehabilitation, and this one specializes in active seniors who want to maintain their independence while having access to support services. Active seniors. Independent living with support services. The euphemisms rolled off his tongue like he'd been practicing them. Clinical terms that made abandonment sound like empowerment. Institutionalization sound like liberation. I listened to them plan my life while I lay in that hospital bed, my voice apparently unnecessary for conversations about my own future. They discussed visiting schedules and personal belongings, medical records and social activities, everything except what I wanted or how I felt about being disposed of like outdated furniture. Mom's always been very social, Liam explained to the social worker, constructing a version of me that bore little resemblance to reality. I think she'll really thrive in an environment with more interaction. Living alone has been isolating for her, especially since Dad passed. Dad didn't pass. Dad walked out when Liam was 3 years old, disappeared into a new life that didn't include his inconvenient family. But apparently, in Liam's revised history, I was a widow rather than an abandoned wife, a woman alone by tragedy rather than by choice. It was a more palatable narrative, one that didn't require him to acknowledge the sacrifices I'd made or the strength I'd shown in raising him single-handedly. Even Sarah nodded along with this fiction, adding her own observations about how difficult it must be for me to maintain such a large apartment, how worried they'd been about me living alone, how relieved they'd feel knowing I was somewhere with proper supervision. Supervision. Like I was a child who couldn't be trusted to make her own decisions, rather than the woman who'd made every important decision in Liam's life until he was old enough to make his own. The discharge meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning. All the stakeholders would be present: Liam, Sarah, the social worker, a representative from the transitional care facility that had been selected as the most appropriate option for my needs. I would be transferred directly from the hospital to my new temporary home, where I could focus on recovery without the stress of independent living. The night before the meeting, I lay awake staring at the ceiling tiles, listening to the sounds of the hospital around me, monitors beeping, nurses padding through hallways, other patients dealing with their own crises and transitions. Somewhere in the building, families were gathering around bedsides, holding hands, making promises to love and support each other through whatever came next. But in my room, there was only silence. The silence of a son who'd stopped seeing me as a person worth consulting about my own life. The silence of a daughter-in-law who'd never quite accepted me as family. The silence of a woman who'd spent 41 years believing that love was enough to guarantee loyalty. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last time Liam had hugged me without it feeling obligatory. The last time he'd called just to hear my voice. The last time he'd looked at me and seen his mother rather than a problem to be solved. But those memories felt like they belonged to someone else's life. Someone who'd been naive enough to believe that sacrifice created unbreakable bonds, rather than simply enabling the people you love to take your devotion for granted. Tomorrow, they would move me to a place where I'd be safe and supervised and properly cared for by strangers who were paid to smile and show concern. Tomorrow, I would officially become someone else's responsibility, freeing my son to live his life without the inconvenience of an aging mother who'd apparently outlived her usefulness. Tomorrow, the transformation would be complete. I would stop being Eva Morrison, the woman who'd built a life through love and determination, and become simply another elderly resident in a facility designed to warehouse the unwanted. But tonight, in the darkness of that hospital room, something else was beginning to stir. Something that felt less like resignation and more like recognition. Something that whispered that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of my story. Maybe it was the beginning. The Golden Years Transitional Care Facility smelled like industrial disinfectant, mixed with overcooked vegetables and the particular sadness that accumulates in places where people go to wait for death. My room was clean and functional. A hospital bed, a small dresser, a chair by the window that looked out onto a courtyard where no one ever seemed to sit, despite the carefully placed benches and cheerful flower beds. "You'll love it here, Mom," Liam said on move-in day, his voice carrying the forced enthusiasm of someone trying to convince himself as much as me. "Look, you have your own bathroom, and the nurse's station is right down the hall. You'll never have to worry about falling again." He'd brought exactly 3 boxes of my belongings, the items he'd deemed essential for my new life. Missing were the photo albums that documented his childhood, the china cabinet my mother had left me, the countless small treasures that make a house feel like home. Those had been too much for the space, and were being stored safely until I was ready for them again, as if this were a temporary vacation rather than an exile with no return date. Sarah stood in the doorway, her purse clutched tightly against her chest like a shield, already calculating how quickly they could complete this transaction and return to their real lives. She'd brought flowers, cheap carnations from the grocery store, and placed them on my windowsill with the careful attention of someone fulfilling an obligation. "The staff seems very nice," she offered, glancing around the sterile room with obvious discomfort. "And they said meals are served in the dining room. You'll meet other residents. It'll be like having roommates again." Roommates? As if I were a college freshman starting an adventure rather than a woman being warehoused against her will. The intake coordinator, a tired-looking woman named Janet with a forced smile and a clipboard full of forms, explained the facility's policies with the mechanical precision of someone who'd given this speech countless times. Mealtimes were non-negotiable. Medications would be administered by staff only. Visitors needed to sign in and out. Overnight guests were not permitted. We find that structure helps our residents feel secure, Janet explained, looking at Liam rather than me, even though she was supposedly addressing my needs. Many of our clients have difficulty with decision-making at this stage, so we handle the details. It reduces anxiety. This stage, as if aging were a disease that robbed you of basic competence rather than simply the accumulation of years and experience. "What if I want to go out?" I asked, the first words I'd spoken since arriving. "To the library or shopping or just for a walk?" Janet's smile became more forced. "Well, Mrs. Morrison, we do have supervised outings planned throughout the week. On Wednesdays, we have a shopping trip to the local mall, and Fridays we visit the community center for social activities. Of course, any outside activities need to be cleared through our care coordinators for safety reasons. Supervised outings. Cleared through coordinators." I'd gone from being an independent woman to a child who needed permission to leave the building. Liam nodded approvingly. "That sounds perfect. Mom's always been impulsive about wanting to go places. This way, she'll have structure and supervision." Impulsive. For 41 years, I'd been the most responsible person in his life, the one who planned and saved and sacrificed to ensure his needs were met. But apparently, wanting basic freedom made me impulsive now. The first weeks at Golden Years were an education in invisibility. During meals, I tried to join conversations with other residents, but found myself speaking to people who'd already been trained to accept their diminished circumstances. They discussed their children's visits with the desperate gratitude of people who understood they were lucky to receive any attention at all. "My daughter comes every Sunday after church," Mrs. Patterson would say, her voice bright with the forced cheer of someone trying to convince herself that once-a-week duty visits constituted love. "She brings her children sometimes. They're so busy with school and activities. You know how it is. My son calls me every Tuesday evening," added Mr. Jeffries, as if this scheduled obligation were evidence of devotion rather than the bare minimum of filial duty. "He's very important at his company, always traveling for business." I listened to these testimonies of abandonment disguised as blessing, these careful rationalizations that allowed everyone to maintain the fiction that their families hadn't simply found socially acceptable ways to dispose of them. These people had been trained to be grateful for scraps, to accept neglect as normalcy, to shrink their expectations until any gesture of acknowledgement felt like a gift. But I wasn't ready to accept that diminishment. Not yet. During the first family meeting, a monthly requirement designed to review my progress and adjustment, I tried to assert some control over my own life. Liam arrived with Sarah and a folder of notes, prepared to discuss my situation like I was a business problem requiring optimization. "How has Mom been adapting?" he asked Janet, as if I weren't sitting right there at the table. "Mrs. Morrison is still adjusting to our routine," Janet replied diplomatically. "She's expressed some resistance to our meal schedule and our medication protocols. It's normal for residents to need time to appreciate the benefits of structured care." Resistance, appreciation. The language was carefully chosen to frame my desire for autonomy as a character flaw that needed to be managed rather than a reasonable human response to institutional control. "I'm not resistant," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "I'm capable of deciding when I want to eat and what medications I need. I'm not senile. I don't have dementia. I'm here because I fell once, not because I've lost my mind." The silence that followed was uncomfortable, the kind that happens when someone says something true, but inconvenient. Liam shifted in his chair, Sarah studied her hands, and Janet made a note on her ever-present clipboard. "Mom," Liam said finally, his tone patronizing in the way that made my teeth clench. "No one's saying you've lost your mind, but you have to admit that managing everything on your own was becoming difficult. The fall proved that you need more support than you were getting." The fall. He spoke about it like it was evidence of my general decline rather than the direct result of his abandonment. Like I'd simply become too frail to function, rather than being left helpless on a bathroom floor while he walked away from my cries for help. "The fall happened because you locked me in that bathroom," I said quietly, watching his face carefully for any sign of acknowledgement or remorse. His expression didn't change. "Mom, we've been through this. I had to take an important call. I thought you were just resting. Sometimes your memory isn't as clear as you think it is." My memory. Now, my recollection of events was being questioned. my perception of reality dismissed as the confused ramblings of an elderly woman whose mind couldn't be trusted. This was how gaslighting worked, not through dramatic confrontations, but through small, persistent suggestions that your own experience wasn't reliable. Sarah nodded supportively. The stress of living alone can affect memory, she added, her voice gentle but firm. It's actually very common in seniors who've experienced trauma like falls. Seniors who've experienced trauma. They'd managed to transform my abandonment into my trauma, my clear memory into age-related confusion, my justified anger into evidence of cognitive decline. Janet made more notes. We do see this frequently with new residents. The transition can be confusing, and sometimes people misremember events from stressful periods. Mrs. Morrison, it might help to focus on moving forward rather than relitigating past incidents. Relitigating, as if seeking acknowledgement of what had actually happened was some kind of frivolous legal action rather than a basic human need for truth and accountability. The meeting continued with discussions of my medication schedule, my meal compliance, my attitude toward staff suggestions. Everything about my daily existence was analyzed and evaluated, but never with the goal of understanding what I wanted or needed. The assumption was that I was no longer capable of making reasonable decisions about my own life. When they finished discussing my case, Liam stood up with the satisfied air of someone who'd completed a necessary but unpleasant task. This all sounds very positive. I'm glad Mom's getting the care she needs. The care I needed. Not the care I wanted. Not the life I chose. But the care that made everyone else comfortable with their decisions about my future. As they prepared to leave, I made one last attempt to reach the son I'd raised, the boy who'd once promised he'd always love me. Liam, could you stay for a few more minutes? Maybe we could take a walk in the courtyard. Just the two of us. He checked his watch. An expensive one I'd never seen before. Probably a recent purchase enabled by not having to support his inconvenient mother. I wish I could, Mom, but Sarah and I have dinner plans. Maybe next week. Maybe next week. The promise of someone buying time they had no intention of spending. After they left, I sat by my window watching other families in the parking lot, children visiting aging parents, bringing grandchildren for brief, dutiful interactions before loading everyone back into cars and driving away to their real lives. I thought about all the Sunday dinners I'd cooked for Liam when he was building his career, all the times I'd babysat his friends' children so he could network at professional events, all the ways I'd supported his ambitions, even when it meant sacrificing my own needs. But apparently, that investment had been a loan rather than a gift, and now the borrower had declared bankruptcy rather than pay what he owed. The woman in the mirror that night looked older than 63, worn down by more than hip surgery and institutional food. She looked like someone who'd spent her life believing in reciprocity, only to discover that love, for some people, was a one-way transaction. But there was still something in her eyes that refused to be extinguished. Something that remembered who she'd been before she became a problem to be managed. Something that was beginning to wonder what might happen if she stopped being so convenient to dismiss. 3 months into my stay at Golden Years, I stopped counting the days. Time became a meaningless concept when every 24 hours looked identical. Breakfast at 7:30, medications at 9, supervised activities at 11, lunch at noon, rest period at 2, dinner at 5, lights out at 9. My life had been reduced to a schedule designed by people who'd never asked what I wanted my days to look like. The worst part wasn't the institutional food, or the patronizing staff, or even the way my freedom had been parceled out in supervised 15-minute increments. The worst part was watching myself disappear piece by piece, like a photograph left too long in sunlight until nothing remained but the faintest outline of what had once been there. Liam's visits became increasingly sporadic. What started as weekly obligations became bi-weekly check-ins, then monthly duty calls, then seasonal appearances timed to coincide with holidays when his absence would be too obvious to ignore. Each visit grew shorter and more perfunctory, until I felt like a box on a to-do list that needed to be checked off before he could move on to more important matters. "How are you feeling, Mom?" he'd ask, already reaching for his coat before I could answer, his eyes scanning the room for anything that might require his attention so he could address it quickly and leave with a clear conscience. "I'm fine," I learned to say, because any other answer would prompt a conversation with staff about adjusting my medications or increasing my level of care. "Everything's fine. Fine." The word became my shield against a world that had decided my actual feelings were symptoms to be managed rather than experiences to be acknowledged. But nothing was fine. I was suffocating in a life that felt borrowed from someone else, going through the motions of existence while my real self withered away like a plant kept alive in artificial light. I'd become what the facility wanted me to become, a compliant patient who caused no trouble and required minimal intervention. The other residents had accepted their diminishment with a grace I found both admirable and terrifying. They'd learned to find joy in small things: a phone call from a grandchild, a decent meal in the dining room, a visit from a volunteer who read to them from books they hadn't chosen. They'd made peace with being managed rather than living, supervised rather than free. "You have to adjust your expectations," Mrs. Patterson told me during one of our conversations in the common room, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd learned to survive by shrinking her dreams to fit her circumstances. "Our children have their own lives now. We can't expect them to drop everything for us the way we did for them." But I remembered dropping everything. I remembered 20 years of putting Liam's needs before my own, of saying no to opportunities and relationships and adventures because being his mother was the most important job I'd ever have. I remembered believing that investment would create a bond strong enough to withstand anything life might throw at us. Apparently, I'd been wrong about what I was building. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in March, exactly 6 months after my fall. I'd been expecting Liam for his monthly visit, had even asked the staff if I could have my hair done in the facility's small salon so I'd look presentable for my son. I'd worn the blue sweater he'd always said brought out my eyes, the one I'd been saving for special occasions that seemed increasingly rare. But instead of Liam, I received a phone call from Sarah. "Hi, Eva," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're about to deliver news they know will be disappointing. "I'm calling because Liam got tied up with a work emergency. He won't be able to make it today after all." A work emergency on a Tuesday afternoon. More likely, he'd simply forgotten about our scheduled visit until the last minute and decided that whatever else he had planned was more important than seeing his mother. "Will he be able to reschedule?" I asked, hating how desperate I sounded, how much I needed to believe that this visit mattered to him even a fraction as much as it mattered to me. "He's going to try," Sarah replied, but her tone suggested we both knew this was polite fiction. "Things have been really crazy at the office lately. This new project has everyone working overtime." The new project. There was always a new project, a new crisis, a new reason why Liam's professional obligations took precedence over any personal commitments. I'd raised him to be ambitious and successful, and now that ambition was the excuse he used to justify neglecting the woman who'd made his achievements possible. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my room staring at my reflection in the small mirror above my dresser. The blue sweater that was supposed to bring out my eyes only emphasized how faded I'd become, how much of my vitality had been drained away by months of institutional living. I looked like what I'd become, a forgotten old woman waiting for visits that might never come. That night, I made a decision that terrified me with its finality. I took out a piece of the facility's letterhead and began writing what I thought might be my last letter to my son. "Dear Liam," I wrote, my handwriting shakier than I remembered it being, "I want you to know that I understand. I understand that I've become a burden you never asked for, a responsibility that interferes with the life you've built for yourself. I understand that visiting me feels like an obligation rather than a joy, that caring for me has become a chore rather than an expression of love." I stopped writing and looked at the words I'd put on paper. They felt true in a way that made my chest ache, acknowledgments of realities I'd been trying to deny for months. "I don't want to be your burden anymore," I continued. "I don't want you to feel guilty about pursuing your happiness. You've done enough. You've provided me with safe housing and medical care, and that's more than many children do for their aging parents. I release you from any further obligation to me." The words felt like small deaths as I wrote them, each sentence a recognition that the relationship I'd treasured most in my life had become something neither of us wanted to maintain. "Please don't feel guilty about this," I added. "You've lived up to your responsibilities. You've been a good son in all the ways that matter officially. I hope you'll remember me as I was when you were young, when loving you was the easiest and most natural thing in the world." I signed the letter with shaking hands and sealed it in an envelope that I addressed to his home, rather than his office. This wasn't professional correspondence. This was the final conversation between a mother and a son, conducted in the only way that seemed safe anymore, through words on paper rather than face-to-face honesty that might create the kind of scene that would embarrass us both. But as I held that envelope, something unexpected happened. Instead of the relief I'd expected to feel after releasing him from his burden, I felt a surge of anger so pure and fierce that it surprised me with its intensity. Why should I make this easy for him? Why should I absolve him of guilt for abandoning the woman who'd sacrificed everything for his well-being? Why should I pretend that his neglect was acceptable just because it came wrapped in the language of professional obligation and adult responsibility? I'd spent 6 months learning to shrink myself to fit other people's comfort zones, accepting diminishment because it was easier than fighting for the dignity I deserved. I'd allowed myself to be managed and medicated and scheduled into submission because resistance seemed futile and exhausting. But sitting in that sterile room, holding a letter that would grant my son permission to forget me entirely, I realized that I had a choice I'd been refusing to acknowledge. I could disappear quietly, gratefully, the way everyone expected elderly inconveniences to fade away when their usefulness expired. I could become another forgotten resident who caused no trouble and made no demands and accepted whatever scraps of attention fell their way. Or I could remember who I'd been before I became a problem to be solved. I could remember the woman who'd built a life through determination and sacrifice, who'd faced abandonment before and survived it, who'd never learned to accept defeat as permanent or final. I tore up the letter. The pieces fell to the floor like snow, like confetti, like the remnants of a surrender I was no longer willing to make. Each torn fragment represented a different choice. Not acceptance, but resistance. Not gratitude for minimal care, but expectation of earned respect. Not quiet disappearance, but loud, inconvenient, unapologetic presence. I wasn't ready to make this easy for anyone. Not for Liam, who'd learned to take my love for granted. Not for Sarah, who'd never seen me as anything more than an inherited obligation. Not for the facility staff who preferred compliant patients to human beings with legitimate needs and desires, and especially not for myself. For 41 years, I'd defined myself through my relationship to my son, measuring my worth by how well I served his needs and supported his dreams. But maybe it was time to remember that I'd existed before he was born, that I'd had hopes and ambitions and strength that belonged to me alone. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for permission to matter. Maybe it was time to remind everyone, including myself, that Eva Morrison wasn't finished yet. The woman in the mirror that night looked different somehow, less faded and more focused. There was something in her eyes that had been missing for months, something that looked almost like determination, something that whispered I still had fight left in me, and I was finally ready to use it. The morning after I tore up that letter, I woke up different. Not visibly. To the staff bustling around golden years, I was the same compliant Mrs. Morrison who took her medications on schedule and attended their mandatory activities without complaint. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. I'd stopped performing the role of grateful patient and started watching, really watching, the world around me. For months, I'd been sleepwalking through my days, accepting each indignity as inevitable, each loss of autonomy as reasonable. But now I observed everything with the sharp attention of someone gathering intelligence. I studied the staff routines, memorized shift changes, listened to conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. Knowledge, I realized, was the first step toward reclaiming power. I learned that Janet, the intake coordinator who spoke about residents like inventory items, was having an affair with Dr. Brennan, the facility's medical director. Their hushed conversations in his office weren't about patient care. They were about weekend trips and hotel reservations and how to hide their relationship from Janet's husband. I discovered that the nutritious meals we were served came from the cheapest food service company in the state, with markup rates that would have scandalized the families paying premium prices for quality care. The fresh vegetables advertised in the facility brochures were canned products relabeled to look healthier than they were. Most importantly, I realized that the other residents weren't as resigned as they appeared. In quiet moments, during late-night bathroom trips, in the garden when staff weren't watching, in whispered conversations during supervised activities, they shared their own stories of abandonment and institutionalization. Many of them were as sharp and capable as they'd ever been, but they'd learned that appearing helpless was safer than demanding respect. The trick, Mrs. Patterson told me one evening as we sat in the courtyard watching the sunset, is to let them think you've accepted this place. Fight them, and they'll increase your medications until you can't think clearly enough to resist. Play along, and you maintain some dignity even if you lose your freedom. It was a survival strategy born of bitter experience, and I began to understand how thoroughly the system was designed to break down resistance. Families felt justified in abandoning inconvenient relatives because professionals assured them it was for the best. Staff could ignore legitimate complaints because anyone who protested too vigorously was obviously having adjustment issues that required pharmaceutical intervention. But I had something most of the other residents lacked: recent experience with independence, and a son who'd made the mistake of underestimating the woman who'd raised him. I started small. During phone calls with Liam, brief, duty-bound conversations that followed the same script every time, I began asking questions that seemed innocent but weren't. "How's the new project going?" I'd ask, keeping my voice light and grandmotherly. "It's challenging, but we're making progress," he'd respond automatically. "What kind of project is it? I've always been interested in your work, you know." A pause. Liam had grown so accustomed to dismissing my questions as the irrelevant curiosity of an old woman that he'd forgotten I'd once managed household finances for 2 people, balanced budgets, and made complex decisions. He'd erased my competence from his memory so completely that he saw no danger in sharing details about his professional life. Over several conversations, I learned that his architectural firm was competing for a major municipal contract, a library renovation that would establish his reputation and potentially lead to partnership in the firm. It was the opportunity he'd been working toward for years, and the pressure was enormous. I also learned through careful questioning that sounded like motherly concern that he and Sarah were struggling financially. Despite his good salary, they'd overextended themselves buying the house, the cars, the lifestyle that his professional image required. The monthly payments for my care at Golden Years were stretching their budget to the breaking point. "We're managing," he assured me when I expressed worry about the cost. "It's important that you get proper care." But his voice carried the strain of someone drowning in obligations he'd created for himself. The expensive facility that was supposed to solve his mother problem was actually becoming another burden he couldn't easily escape. Armed with this knowledge, I began to remember things I'd forced myself to forget. I remembered the woman I'd been at 22, young and terrified, but determined to build a good life for herself and her son without help from anyone. I remembered the strength it had taken to work double shifts while attending nursing school part-time, studying medical texts by lamplight after Liam was asleep. I remembered the satisfaction of paying my own bills, making my own decisions, solving my own problems without asking permission or seeking approval from people who saw me as a burden rather than a person. Most importantly, I remembered that I'd survived David's abandonment by refusing to define myself through his rejection. I'd built a new life from the ashes of a failed marriage, and I'd done it with grace and determination, and the kind of quiet strength that people often mistake for weakness. That woman was still inside me, buried under months of institutional conditioning and learned helplessness, but not destroyed. She was just waiting for the right moment to remind everyone what Eva Morrison was capable of when she stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. I began making phone calls during the facility's rest periods, when most residents napped and staff assumed I was doing the same. I called old colleagues from my nursing days, women who'd retired but maintained connections to the medical community. I reached out to former neighbors, people who remembered me as the competent woman who'd organized block parties and volunteered at the school library. "Eva Morrison, Dr. Susan Chen exclaimed when I called her at the clinic where she'd worked as a nurse practitioner before retiring. "I was just thinking about you the other day. How are you? I heard you had some surgery." Some surgery. News traveled fast in small communities, and I realized that my situation was probably well known among people who'd once respected me as a colleague and friend. They knew I'd been placed in a facility, but they didn't know why or whether I'd chosen it myself. "I'm recovering well," I told Susan, choosing my words carefully. "Actually, I'm thinking about getting back into nursing. Part-time, maybe volunteer work. Do you know if anyone needs experienced help?" The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know about how my situation was perceived in the professional community. People who'd once valued my skills and judgment now saw me as a woman whose family had decided she needed institutional care. In their minds, that changed everything about my competence and capabilities. "Well," Susan said carefully, "there might be some volunteer opportunities at the senior center. Nothing too demanding, of course. Just light duties, socializing with clients, that sort of thing." Light duties, socializing with clients. As if my 40 years of medical training and experience had been erased by a few months in a care facility. As if I'd become one of the people who needed help, rather than someone capable of providing it. But that conversation taught me something valuable. My professional reputation was damaged, but not destroyed. More importantly, it reminded me that I had skills and knowledge that extended far beyond my role as Liam's mother. I'd been a nurse, a caregiver, a woman who'd helped other people navigate medical crises and family transitions. I knew how healthcare systems worked, understood patient rights and family dynamics, and the legal frameworks that governed elder care. I knew the difference between necessary medical intervention and institutional convenience, between appropriate safety measures and authoritarian control. Most importantly, I knew that everything happening to me was happening to countless other women whose families had found socially acceptable ways to dispose of them when caregiving became inconvenient. That knowledge felt like a flame being kindled in my chest. Not anger anymore, but something more focused and purposeful. Not just personal grievance, but recognition of a larger injustice that needed to be addressed. I started keeping a journal, writing down observations about the facility, conversations with staff, examples of policies that prioritized convenience over dignity. I documented the systematic ways residents were discouraged from advocating for themselves, the financial arrangements that incentivized longer stays regardless of medical necessity. "What are you writing?" asked Margaret, one of the newer residents, during an evening when I sat by my window making notes. "Just thoughts," I replied, but something in my tone must have suggested this wasn't casual reminiscing. Margaret moved closer, lowering her voice. "You know, my daughter thinks I can't remember things anymore, but I remember everything. I remember exactly how she talked about me before placing me here, like I was already dead and she was just arranging my burial. She was 71, sharp as a tack, placed in golden years, because her daughter found it easier to pay for professional care than to arrange family support during her recovery from knee surgery. Like me, she'd been transformed from an independent woman into a managed patient through a combination of family convenience and institutional momentum. "Do you ever think about what we could do if we worked together?" I asked quietly. Margaret's eyes lit up with something I hadn't seen in any resident's face since arriving at Golden Years. Something that looked like hope mixed with mischief, the expression of someone who just realized she wasn't as powerless as she'd been trained to believe. "What do you have in mind?" she whispered. I closed my journal and looked at this woman who, like me, had been written off by people who'd never bothered to ask what she wanted for her own life. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted, "but I know that this—" I gestured around the sterile room, the institutional furniture, the controlled environment that kept us safe and diminished, "isn't how our stories have to end." For the first time in months, I wasn't planning for survival or acceptance or quiet resignation. I was planning for revolution. Planning a revolution from inside an institution designed to suppress independence requires patience, subtlety, and the kind of strategic thinking that comes from decades of managing difficult situations with limited resources. Over the next month, I moved through Golden Years like a different person, still compliant on the surface, but gathering allies and information with the focused intensity of someone preparing for war. Margaret became my first recruit, and together we identified others who'd retained their mental sharpness despite months or years of institutional conditioning. There was Robert, a retired teacher whose family had placed him here after a minor stroke, even though his recovery had been complete months ago. Eleanor, a former social worker who understood systems and bureaucracies better than most of the staff. James, a veteran who'd built successful businesses but whose children had convinced him he was too confused to manage his own finances. We met in small groups during supposedly random encounters, conversations in the garden that looked like casual socializing, card games in the common room where we discussed more than the hands we'd been dealt, walks around the courtyard where we shared information and planned our next moves. "The key," Eleanor explained during one of these carefully orchestrated meetings, "is documentation. Everything they do to us, every policy that restricts our rights, every financial arrangement that prioritizes profit over care, It all has to be recorded and verified before anyone will take our complaints seriously. She was right, of course. Individual grievances could be dismissed as the confused ramblings of elderly patients, but systematic documentation of institutional abuse was harder to ignore. We began keeping detailed records, not just my journal, but coordinated observations from multiple residents across different shifts and situations. Robert, with his teacher's attention to detail, documented the medication protocols that seemed designed more to ensure compliance than to address medical needs. Eleanor tracked the financial irregularities she'd noticed, overcharging for basic services, billing for therapies that never occurred, equipment rentals for devices that were never delivered. James, despite his family's claims about his confusion, had maintained his sharp business instincts and began analyzing the facility's corporate structure. What he discovered was enlightening. Golden Years was owned by a subsidiary of a larger corporation that operated dozens of similar facilities across 3 states, all following the same profit-maximizing strategies that prioritized occupancy rates over resident satisfaction. They make more money when people stay longer, he explained during one of our evening meetings. The longer we're here, the more they can bill insurance and families. They have no incentive to help us regain independence or return to our own homes. Meanwhile, I continued my careful conversations with Liam, each phone call an opportunity to gather more intelligence about his situation, while planting seeds that would grow into the confrontation I was planning. "You sound tired," I told him during one of our scheduled calls, keeping my voice filled with maternal concern. "Are you getting enough sleep?" "The project deadline got moved up," he replied, and I could hear the stress in his voice even through his attempt to sound in control. "We're working 16-hour days, and if we don't land this contract—" He didn't finish the sentence, but I didn't need him to. I'd learned enough about his financial situation to understand that his career was balanced on a knife's edge, that the image of success he'd cultivated was maintained through a precarious combination of debt and professional gambling. "Maybe you should consider delegating some responsibilities," I suggested carefully. "Focus on what's most important." "I wish I could, Mom, but everything feels important right now. The house payments, your care, Sarah's expectations about our lifestyle. Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in obligations I never wanted." Obligations he never wanted, including me, apparently. But his stress was also an opportunity, because stressed people make mistakes, and when Liam made his inevitable mistake, I intended to be ready. I also began reaching out beyond the facility, using the few phone privileges we were allowed to contact people who'd known me in my professional life. Some conversations were disappointing. Former colleagues who clearly saw me as a woman whose family had determined she needed care, and who were therefore hesitant to engage with my concerns about the facility. But others were more encouraging. Dr. Patricia Williams, who'd been chief of staff at the hospital where I'd worked for 12 years, remembered me as a competent professional whose judgment she'd trusted in difficult situations. "Eva, I've been wondering how you are doing," she said when I reached her at home one evening. "I heard about your placement, but it surprised me. You always struck me as someone who'd age in place, maintain your independence as long as possible." The phrase, "your placement," told me everything I needed to know about how my situation was being perceived in the medical community. I hadn't chosen Golden Years. I'd been placed there, like a problem requiring professional management. "Actually, Patricia, that's why I'm calling. I'm documenting some concerns about patient rights and care standards here, and I wondered if you might have contacts at the state health department who oversee facility licensing." The silence that followed was long enough to make me wonder if the call had been disconnected. "Ava," she said finally, her voice careful and professional, "are you saying there are violations occurring at your facility?" "I'm saying there are practices that prioritize institutional convenience over patient autonomy, and I think someone with oversight authority should be aware of them." Another pause, then, "Send me what you have. I'll make sure it gets to the right people." That conversation gave me something I'd been missing for months: validation that my concerns were legitimate, that my observations mattered, that the woman who'd once been respected for her professional judgment hadn't disappeared just because her son had decided she was inconvenient. But the most important development came 3 weeks later, when I overheard a conversation between Janet and Dr. Brennan that confirmed what I'd suspected about the facility's operations. I'd been walking past his office when I heard raised voices, not arguing exactly, but the kind of tense discussion that happens when people are trying to solve a problem that could threaten their comfortable arrangements. "The state inspector is coming next month," Janet was saying, her voice tight with anxiety. Someone filed a formal complaint about care standards, and they're doing a surprise audit. Who filed the complaint? Dr. Brennan asked, and I could hear papers rustling as if he were searching through documents. I don't know. It was anonymous, routed through the health department. But whoever it was had detailed information about our operations. Medication protocols, staffing ratios, financial arrangements. This wasn't some family member with a vague grievance. This was someone who understands how these places work. My heart began beating faster. Someone had already filed a complaint. Someone with enough knowledge to make it credible and specific enough to trigger an investigation. It might have been Patricia, following up on our conversation. Or it might have been someone else entirely who'd noticed the same problems I'd documented. Either way, the timing was perfect for what I'd been planning. We need to make sure all our documentation is in order, Dr. Brennan continued, and maybe review some of our more flexible policies until after the inspection. Flexible policies. I wondered if that included the medication protocols that kept difficult residents sedated, or the financial arrangements that maximized billing while minimizing actual services. That evening, I called Liam with news that sounded like casual conversation, but was actually strategic planning. I've been thinking about your stress levels, I told him, my voice filled with motherly concern. Maybe it would help if you didn't worry so much about visiting me. I know how busy you are with the project. Are you sure, Mom? I mean, I want to see you. It's just that things are so crazy right now. Of course I'm sure. Focus on your work. I'll be fine here. But I wouldn't be fine here much longer, and neither would he. The state inspection would happen whether we were ready or not, and when it did, the carefully constructed fiction that Golden Years was providing quality care would begin to crumble. When that happened, families would start asking difficult questions about why they were paying premium prices for substandard care. Sons who'd placed inconvenient mothers in expensive facilities would suddenly find themselves facing not just financial pressure, but potential legal liability for the systematic neglect they'd enabled. I spent the next week making final preparations, organizing my documentation, coordinating with my fellow residents, and preparing for the conversation I'd been planning since the night I tore up that surrender letter. The woman in the mirror looked different now than she had 6 months ago. Not older or more frail, but sharper somehow, more focused. There was something in her eyes that hadn't been there since before the fall, something that looked like purpose, something that looked like a woman who'd remembered what she was capable of when she stopped asking permission to matter. Liam would come for his monthly visit soon, bringing his practiced expressions of concern and his hurried schedule and his barely concealed relief that I was someone else's responsibility now. But this time, the visit would be different. This time, I wouldn't be the grateful patient he expected to find. This time, I'd be the mother who'd raised him. The woman he'd apparently forgotten was smart enough to recognize manipulation, strong enough to resist it, and experienced enough to know exactly how to make him remember who he was dealing with. The calm before the storm always feels deceptively peaceful, but underneath the surface, everything is already in motion. Everything was about to change. The morning of the state inspection, I woke up at 5:30 and dressed with the deliberate care of someone preparing for the most important performance of her life. Not the faded house dress and cardigan that had become my uniform of institutional compliance, but the navy blue suit I'd worn to job interviews decades ago, the one that still hung in my closet like a reminder of the professional woman I'd once been. The inspection team arrived at 9:30 sharp. 3 officials with clipboards and badges who moved through Golden Years with the methodical attention of people who'd learned to spot institutional deception from across a room. I watched from the common room as they examined medication logs, interviewed staff members, and documented the kinds of violations that looked minor on paper, but represented daily indignities for the people who lived here. By noon, their preliminary findings were clear enough to generate the kind of hushed, urgent conversations between administrators that meant serious problems had been identified. Janet spent most of the afternoon on phone calls with corporate headquarters, her voice carrying the particular strain of someone trying to explain how their carefully constructed system had been exposed by people they'd underestimated. At 2:15, my phone rang with the call I'd been expecting. "Mom?" Liam's voice carried a tension I hadn't heard since he was a child calling me from school when he'd gotten in trouble. "I just got a call from Golden Years. They said there's some kind of investigation happening, and they wanted to make sure I knew about it. Yes, I heard about that, I said calmly, sitting in my newly organized room surrounded by the documentation I'd been gathering for weeks. State Health Department, I believe. Something about care standards. Do you know what this is about? I mean, have you noticed any problems with your care? The question hung between us like a bridge he didn't realize he was burning. For months, he'd dismissed my concerns as the confused complaints of an elderly woman who couldn't adapt to institutional life. Now, suddenly, he was asking for my assessment of the situation, not because he valued my judgment, but because he was afraid of what my answer might cost him. Actually, Liam, I'm glad you called. Could you come in today? I think we need to talk. Today? Mom, I'm in the middle of this huge project deadline, and with this inspection thing happening, I think this is more important than your project, I said, my voice carrying a firmness he hadn't heard from me in months. I really need to see you today. The silence that followed told me he was calculating risks, trying to determine whether ignoring my request would create more problems than accommodating it. Finally, his practical nature won out over his inclination to dismiss me. I can be there by 4, he said, but I can't stay long. That's fine. We won't need long. I spent the remaining hours making final preparations, organizing documents, confirming details with my fellow residents, and rehearsing the conversation I'd been planning since the night I'd decided to stop making things easy for the people who'd written me off. At exactly 4 o'clock, Liam appeared in my doorway looking harried and impatient, his expensive suit wrinkled from a day of crisis management, his phone clutched in his hand like a lifeline to the professional world that mattered more to him than family obligations. "Hi, Mom," he said, giving me the perfunctory kiss on the cheek that had replaced real affection years ago. "You look different. That's a nice outfit." "Thank you. Please sit down. We have some things to discuss." He remained standing, his body language broadcasting his eagerness to complete this visit and return to more important matters. "Is this about the inspection? Because I want you to know that if there are real problems here, we'll find you another facility. Money isn't the issue. Money wasn't the issue." From a man who'd told me repeatedly about his financial stress, whose care facility payments were straining his budget to the breaking point, who'd chosen Golden Years not for its quality, but for its willingness to accept insurance coverage with minimal family contribution. "Sit down, Liam," I repeated, my voice carrying the authoritative tone I'd used when he was a child who needed to listen carefully to important information. Something in my demeanor must have penetrated his distraction, because he finally lowered himself into the chair across from my bed, though he kept his phone visible and ready for urgent interruptions. "First," I began, opening the folder I'd prepared for this moment, "I want you to understand what's been happening here. Not the version you've chosen to believe, but the actual reality of what my life has been like for the past 6 months." I handed him a printed document, a detailed timeline of my placement at Golden Years, beginning with his abandonment of me on the bathroom floor and continuing through every instance of institutional control, medical overreach, and systematic diminishment I'd experienced since my arrival. He scanned the pages with the impatient attention of someone looking for reasons to dismiss what he was reading, but I watched his expression change as the scope and detail of my documentation became clear. "Mom, some of this, you're making it sound like they were deliberately mistreating you, but these are standard care protocols for people in your situation." "My situation," I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to cut through his defensive rationalizations. "Let's talk about my situation, Liam. Let's talk about how I ended up here." I handed him another document, a medical timeline that began with my hip surgery and detailed every aspect of my recovery, including the physician's notes that clearly indicated I'd been ready for independent living within 3 weeks of the procedure. According to my doctor, I could have returned home with minimal support after the first month. Home health aid, maybe some help with groceries and cleaning until I was fully mobile. Instead, I've been institutionalized for 6 months, because it was more convenient for you to pay someone else to manage your inconvenient mother than to arrange family care. "That's not—" "Mom, we discussed this. You fell, you were injured, you needed professional care. I fell because you locked me in that bathroom and walked away while I was calling for help," I said, my voice carrying the weight of 6 months of suppressed truth. "I fell because my son decided that his work call was more important than his mother's safety. I fell because you'd already made the decision that I was a burden you no longer wanted to carry. The color drained from his face as the reality of what I was saying penetrated his carefully constructed narrative of responsible adult decision-making. Mom, that's not what happened. You're confused about— I'm not confused about anything, I interrupted, handing him the final document in my folder. This is a complaint I've filed with the state health department, detailing the systematic violations of patient rights that occur at this facility. It's also been sent to the corporate headquarters of the company that owns Golden Years, to the state insurance commission that investigates billing fraud, and to the local newspaper's investigative reporting team. He stared at the document as if it were written in a foreign language, his mind apparently unable to process that his compliant, manageable mother had become someone capable of taking organized action against the system he'd used to dispose of her. You filed a complaint? Mom, why would you— if you were having problems, you should have told me. I tried to tell you, Liam. For months, I tried to explain what was happening here, how my autonomy was being systematically stripped away, how I was being medicated into compliance and managed like a problem rather than treated like a person. But you didn't want to hear it, because acknowledging my concerns would have meant acknowledging that your solution wasn't working. I stood up from my chair, and for the first time in our conversation, I was looking down at him, literally and figuratively, while he struggled to process information that didn't fit his comfortable assumptions about our relationship. The state inspection that's happening today was triggered by my complaint. The investigators have found numerous violations of care standards, billing irregularities, and documentation of patient rights abuses. Golden Years is facing potential loss of licensing, and every family who's paid for care here is going to be receiving notification about the investigation. What does that mean for— what happens to you if they lose their license? What happens to me? Not concern for my well-being, not remorse for the situation he'd created, but anxiety about how this crisis might affect his own circumstances. What happens to me, Liam, is that I'll be moving out of this facility and back to independent living, which is what I should have been doing months ago if my family had cared enough to support my recovery instead of warehousing me for their convenience. But the cost— Mom, we can't afford to hire private care. And if you're living alone again, I don't need private care. I never needed institutional care. What I needed was a son who remembered that I'd spent 41 years caring for him and who was willing to spend a few weeks helping me recover from surgery. The phone in his hand buzzed with an incoming call, and I watched him glance at it automatically, before looking back at me with something that might have been the beginning of recognition. I have to take this, he said, starting to answer the phone. No, I said firmly, reaching over and taking the device from his hand. For once in the past 6 months, you're going to sit here and listen to your mother without distraction. He stared at me in shock, as if I'd performed magic, rather than simply asserting basic human dignity. This is what's going to happen, I continued, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd rediscovered her power and intended to use it. You're going to help me pack my belongings, and you're going to drive me back to my apartment. You're going to apologize, sincerely, for abandoning me when I needed support, and you're going to spend some time thinking about what kind of man abandons the woman who sacrificed everything to raise him. Mom, I can't just— There are procedures for discharge, and my work situation— Your work situation is about to become much more complicated, I said calmly, because when the local newspaper runs their story about Golden Years, they're going to include interviews with families who placed relatives here, and when they interview you, you're going to have to explain why you institutionalized a woman who didn't need institutional care. The implications hit him like physical blows. His professional reputation, his career prospects, his carefully cultivated image of success— all of it could be destroyed by the revelation that he'd abandoned his mother for convenience and then lied about the circumstances to justify his actions. You wouldn't, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I would, I replied, because I'm not your convenient, manageable mother anymore. I'm Eva Morrison, and I'm done making other people's choices easy when they've made my life impossible. For the first time in months, my son was looking at me and seeing someone he needed to take seriously. Someone who wasn't finished yet. 3 weeks later, I stood in the kitchen of my own apartment, making coffee in my own mug while sunlight streamed through windows I could open whenever I chose. The familiar weight of my house keys in my pocket felt like a small miracle. Such a simple thing, the ability to lock and unlock your own door. But I'd learned not to take any freedom for granted. The transition back to independent living had been smoother than anyone expected. including myself. My body remembered how to navigate my own space, how to cook meals I actually wanted to eat, how to sleep in a bed that belonged to me rather than an institution. More importantly, my mind remembered how to make decisions without asking permission, how to structure my days according to my preferences rather than someone else's schedule. The legal aftermath of the Golden Years investigation had unfolded exactly as I'd predicted. The facility lost its state license within 2 weeks of the inspection, and the corporate parent company faced federal fraud charges for systematic billing violations across multiple states. Families who'd paid premium prices for substandard care were filing lawsuits, and the local newspaper's expose had become a series that other media outlets picked up nationwide. I'd been interviewed twice, once by the state investigators, once by the journalist who'd written the main story. In both cases, I'd presented my documentation calmly and thoroughly, letting the facts speak for themselves without editorializing or seeking sympathy. The truth was devastating enough without embellishment. Mrs. Morrison represents something we see too often, the state investigator had told the reporter. Competent adults who are institutionalized not because they need intensive care, but because families find it more convenient than providing appropriate support during temporary health challenges. Liam's name had been mentioned in the newspaper story, not prominently, but enough to create the professional embarrassment I'd warned him about. His architectural firm had asked him to take a leave of absence while they evaluated whether his judgment issues extended to his professional responsibilities. The municipal contract he'd been pursuing had gone to a competitor, but the most significant change wasn't in the external consequences he faced, it was in the relationship between us, which had been fundamentally altered by his recognition that he'd underestimated the woman who'd raised him. He came to visit me every Saturday now, not out of obligation, but out of something that looked like genuine desire to rebuild what he'd nearly destroyed. The conversations were different, more honest, less performative, conducted between two adults who'd finally acknowledged some difficult truths about their family dynamic. "I keep thinking about what you said," he told me during one of these visits, sitting at my kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug I'd made for him 20 years ago, "about how I'd changed from the person you raised me to be." I looked at this man who was my son, but had become a stranger, then gradually transformed back into someone I could recognize and respect. The expensive clothes were still there, but the arrogance that had accompanied them was gone, replaced by something that looked like humility. "You became someone who measured love by convenience," I said gently. "Someone who forgot that relationships require maintenance and attention, not just financial support." "I thought I was being responsible," he admitted, "taking care of your needs, making sure you were safe and cared for. I told myself that Golden Years was better than anything I could provide at home." "You told yourself that because it was easier than admitting you didn't want to be inconvenienced by your mother's temporary dependency," I replied, but without the anger that had fueled my confrontation with him. "You found a socially acceptable way to abandon me, and you convinced yourself it was for my own good." He flinched at the word abandon, but he didn't argue with my assessment. "How do I fix this?" he asked. "How do I become the kind of son you deserve to have?" It was the right question, finally, and it had taken the near destruction of his life for him to ask it. "You start by understanding that love isn't something you can delegate to professionals," I told him. "You learn that caring for family members during difficult times isn't a burden. It's a privilege that creates bonds strong enough to last a lifetime." Sarah had left him 2 weeks after the newspaper story was published, taking their shared social circle and most of their mutual friends with her. She'd apparently decided that being married to someone associated with elder abuse was incompatible with the lifestyle she'd envisioned for herself. "She said I'd embarrassed her," Liam told me, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who'd lost something he thought was permanent. "Said she couldn't trust my judgment if I was capable of treating my own mother that way." "Sarah was right about that," I said, refilling his coffee cup. "But maybe losing her wasn't entirely a bad thing. Maybe it gave you a chance to figure out who you are when you're not performing for people who value you for your success rather than your character." He'd moved back to a smaller apartment, sold the expensive car, started therapy to address what he called his priorities problem. The man sitting at my kitchen table looked younger somehow, less burdened by the weight of maintaining an image that had never really fit him anyway. "I used to think success meant never needing help from anyone," he said. Never being dependent, never being vulnerable, never admitting that I couldn't handle everything on my own. That's not success, I replied. That's just isolation disguised as independence. Margaret and Robert and Eleanor and James had also transitioned out of golden years as the facility closed, and we'd maintained our friendships beyond the institutional setting that had brought us together. We met for coffee once a week, not as former patients, but as people who'd survived something difficult and emerged stronger for the experience. You started something important, Eleanor told me during one of these gatherings. Not just for us, but for everyone who's been warehoused when they could have been supported. She was right. The Golden Years investigation had prompted broader scrutiny of elder care facilities across the state, and new regulations were being implemented to protect patient rights and prevent the kind of systematic abuse we'd documented. But the most important victory was personal. I'd reclaimed my autonomy, my dignity, and my sense of myself as someone whose opinions mattered and whose presence in the world had value beyond what I could provide for other people. The woman in the mirror now looked like someone who'd survived a battle and chosen to be generous with her victory. There were new lines around her eyes, evidence of months of strain and struggle, but there was also something peaceful in her expression, the contentment that comes from knowing you fought for yourself when it mattered most. On quiet evenings, when I sat in my own living room reading books I'd chosen from my own shelves, I sometimes thought about the letter I'd almost written, the surrender document that would have released Liam from any obligation to care about my well-being. I was grateful I'd torn it up, not because I'd needed him to save me, but because I'd needed to save myself. The phone rang on a Tuesday evening in June, 6 months after I'd walked out of Golden Years, carrying my belongings in boxes that Liam had loaded into his car with the careful attention of someone handling precious cargo. "Mom?" His voice carried excitement, rather than the dutiful obligation that had characterized our conversations for so long. I got a new job, smaller firm, better people, projects that actually matter. And the first thing they said was that they value employees who understand the importance of family relationships. "That's wonderful," I said, and meant it. "Tell me about the projects." As he described his new work designing affordable housing for seniors who wanted to age in their communities rather than in institutions, I heard something in his voice that had been missing for years, passion for work that served people rather than just advancing his career. "I've been thinking," he said as our conversation wound down. "Maybe you'd like to see the designs. Give me some input from someone who understands what older adults actually need in their living spaces." It was a small thing, asking for my professional opinion, acknowledging that my decades of healthcare experience might be valuable in his architectural work. But it was also everything. Recognition that I was still someone whose knowledge mattered, whose perspective had value, whose partnership he wanted rather than simply tolerated. "I'd like that very much," I told him. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen as evening light faded into darkness, thinking about the journey that had brought me from that bathroom floor to this moment of quiet satisfaction. I'd learned that betrayal can be survived, that dignity can be reclaimed, that it's never too late to remind people what you're capable of when they stop underestimating you. Most importantly, I'd learned that love, real love, isn't about making things easy for people who take your devotion for granted. It's about holding them accountable when they forget who they're supposed to be, and welcoming them back when they remember. I thought about all the women my age who were sitting in institutional settings tonight, convinced that their stories were over, that their voices no longer mattered, that they had no choice but to accept whatever diminishment their families found convenient. I thought about Margaret and Eleanor and Robert and James, who'd discovered that age didn't have to mean powerlessness, that being temporarily vulnerable didn't make you permanently disposable. And I thought about Liam, who'd learned the hard way that some kinds of success come with costs too high to pay, and that the relationships you neglect in pursuit of external achievement might be the only things that matter when everything else falls apart. Tomorrow, I would wake up in my own bed, in my own home, and decide for myself how to spend my day. I would make choices about what to eat, where to go, whom to see, simple freedoms that felt precious because I'd learned what it meant to live without them. But tonight, I was simply grateful to be Eva Morrison again. Not someone's burden, not someone's problem, not someone's obligation to be managed, just a woman who'd fought for herself and won, and who'd taught her son that love without respect isn't really love at all. Sometimes the most important victories are the quiet ones, the battles fought by people the world has written off, the moments when someone refuses to disappear just because others find their presence inconvenient. Sometimes justice comes late, but when it arrives, it's worth the wait. Congratulations! Type 9 in the comments so I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for listening, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.